If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles and want to help keep the show rolling along, the best thing you can do, apart from listening, of course, is to share it with a friend or with anyone you know who's just a bit obsessed with history. The odder, the better. Thanks so much for your support, and I really hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. At the height of Imperial Japan, during the golden age of court intrigue, obsessive hierarchy, and fabulous sophistication, who was the legendary Lothario and Emperor's son, Genji? What can the tale of Genji, a great masterpiece of Japanese literature, tell us about this remarkable and alien world, and the imperial family at the very heart of it? Who was the woman who wrote it at a time when in the West it would have been absolutely unthinkable? Was it the influence of China, Japan's powerful neighbor? And does the story hold the secrets to the divine power of the Japanese emperors? All is about to be revealed. Let's set the scene. Picture the height of Imperial Japan, a world shimmering with silks and secrets, where every gesture meant something, and everyone, from the highest courtiers to the lowest servants, played their part in an endless ballet of intrigue. This was a world obsessed with etiquette and hierarchy, but also with poetry, music, and of course, romance. At its heart, there's one name that still echoes through Japanese culture, almost like a whispered promise: Genji. Legendary Lothario, son of an emperor, and the irresistible centerpiece of what might just be the world's first, greatest novel. But who was Genji really? What can the tale of Genji, that colossal, beguiling masterpiece of Japanese literature, tell us about this alien and captivating world and the imperial family that ruled at its center? And let's not forget the astonishing woman who wrote it, a woman writing at the time when her Western counterparts wouldn't even have been allowed inside the same room, let alone be handed a pen. How did China's mighty shadow influence the story and society it describes? And buried within these pages are the clues to the almost mystical power of Japan's emperors, a power, I think, that would shape a nation's soul for over 1,000 years to come. So, setting the stage, let's dive straight into the drama, shall we? Here's how the story begins. Second among the emperor's many companions, Lady Fujitsubo, not a woman of high rank, but one who, against all the odds, becomes his favorite consort. Instantly, there's resentment, there's gossip, there's a riding tide of envy swirling through the palace corridors. This woman, surrounded by the cold stares of rivals, is forced to retreat in misery, yet the emperor is absolutely besotted. The court, of course, is scandalized. The whispers grow. This is not just a love story. It's an X-ray of the world's most sophisticated court, with all its jealousies and unspoken rules. And that is just the opening paragraph. You see, the tale of Genji, this classic Japanese novel written by Murasaki Shikibu, is not some slim volume you slip into your coat pocket and go and read in the park. In Royal Tyler's definitive translation, the one that I'm going to be quoting from a lot today, it's a staggering 1,000 pages long. It's epic, it's sprawling, it's unafraid to linger on the brush of a sleeve or the scent of incense. So you might be asking, quite reasonably, I have to say, what's a Japanese novel doing on a history podcast? Well, to answer that, let me take a step back. In the West, we have our own giants. We have Don Quixote in Spain. We have the plays of Shakespeare in England. But in Japan, nothing towers quite like Genji. The Nobel Prize-winning novelist Yasunari Kawabata said as much in his acceptance speech back in 1968. And you know what? He's absolutely right. Genji has left fingerprints on everything in Japanese culture, from classical poetry to the wildest corners of anime and manga. Its influence literally runs like a thread, completely unbroken, through 1,000 years of storytelling. And here's the extraordinary thing: the tale of Genji is old. By Western standards, it's practically prehistoric for a novel, written in the early 11th century. At a time, and you have to give thought to this, when Europe was still stumbling through the Dark Ages. Yet its impact on what it meant to be Japanese has been profound, defining the nation's ideals of beauty, grace, and emotional subtlety. So, yeah, it's an historical artifact. But it's more than that, you know. It's a window, one that's been flung wide open on the classical age of Japan for the first true golden era of Japanese civilization. Until now, Japan had actually lived in the long shadow of China, its mighty neighbor, its cultural model, if you like, its occasional tormentor. But by the time Genji comes on the scene, Japan is ready to step out, to craft its own unique identity, to revel in the beauty and the sorrow of its own voice. And if you're used to reading about ancient empires, Egypt, Persia, Rome, Baghdad, I've spoken about them all. Throw into that mix China itself, Genji is a revelation. It's richer, more intimate, more personal than almost anything that survives from those distant courts. All of them. I remember reading it many years ago, tucked away in a quiet corner of Kyoto. I must have only been about 18 or 19, maybe 19. And let me tell you, even at that age, this was unforgettable. It was one of the great reading experiences of my life. And by the end of this episode, I hope you'll see why. However, before we go any deeper, let me say this. My mind was absolutely blown when I realized what was happening in Japan during this so-called classical golden age. I mean, just think about it, folks. While the Anglo-Saxons were busy bashing each other on the head with whatever came to hand, over in Japan, they were producing novels of exquisite psychological depth, sophisticated court rituals, and poetry that would literally move you to tears. The contrast is almost comical. It's like comparing a field full of mud wrestlers, I suppose, to a ballroom of dancers floating by in silk. The difference is that great. But what makes the tale of Genji so fascinating? It's not just a window into Japanese history. It's an entire panoramic view. And before we step too far into the big picture, I want to come back to that opening paragraph, the one with the consorts and the intimates and all that swirling palace intrigue. Let's just unpack what's really going on there, because it's more than just court gossip. It's a snapshot of an entire world. First up, the emperor. He's never actually named. He's this strangely anonymous, almost mythic figure, as if the author wants us to focus less on who he is and more what he represents. This is early 11th century Japan, so we're in the thousands. And although the novel feels historical, set in the 10th century, it's actually deliberately vague. The court is full of layers, ranks within ranks. You've got consorts at the top, women of serious standing. Then you've got the intimates, lower down the social order, but sometimes, as here, the ones who actually win the emperor's heart. So what happens? Well, in classic folk tale style, our low-ranking intimate becomes pregnant. The emperor, thrilled, can't wait to see the baby. And when he does, and this is straight from the text of Genji, he's literally gobsmacked by the child's beauty. The older son and the heir apparent has all the political power and family backing that he could more than wish for. But let's be honest, he can't just compete in the looks department. And of course, this is where the fairy tale dynamics really kick in. You've got the favored older brother destined for the throne, and the dazzlingly handsome, endlessly talented younger brother, Genji, the shining prince, whose only flaw is his mother's lack of status. The emperor loves his younger son, but rules are rules, and there's no way Genji can be named heir. What's a besotted father to do? So the emperor comes up with this ingenious, if drastic, solution. He takes the unprecedented step of giving his son a surname, Genji, and with that officially removes him from the imperial family. It's never been done before, but it means that the shining prince now exists in a strange, liminal world. He's the emperor's son, still a central figure at court, but he's also a nobleman and part of the wider aristocracy. And that right there is the engine of the entire novel. Genji has to navigate this dual existence, forever balancing his royal blood against the reality of being something lesser. He's dazzling at everything: poetry, music, calligraphy, even the subtle art of mixing incense. And as it turns out, he's not half bad at football either. Yes, football. It's in the novel. No, I'm not making that up. Apparently, the imperial court had their own version, lively and a bit rough and tumble, but it was definitely football. Now, you might think with all these gifts, Genji would be content, but there's always that tension. He's close to the center, but never quite in it. And the emperor, desperate for his beloved son to amount to something, tries to secure him a prominent place in country life, of course, without breaking the rules of succession. So that's our setup: a golden prince, exiled by birth, fated for brilliance, adored and envied in equal measure. It's the stuff of legend and the starting point for everything that then follows. But what about the world that Genji moves through? Now, if you know anything about Japanese history and culture, or let's be honest, if you've played the latest Assassin's Creed game or binged on the new Shogun TV series, you'll actually have a sense of the world that I'm talking about. But the court of Genji's time is something different, something extraordinary. And next, we'll walk right into its candlelit corridors, where every fan, every glance, every flick of the wrist means something more than words could ever say. Now, let's just pause for a moment, because if you picture classic Japan, and I know what you're seeing, you're seeing those soaring temple roofs, silent, stoic samurai, maybe some tragic souls taking their own lives out of shame. The geisha, with their exquisite kimonos and powdered faces, sushi and kabuki, and all the other hallmarks of later Japanese tradition. But here's the twist, guys. Forget all of that. Not one of those things existed in Japan yet. There are no samurai in the tale of Genji. There are no geisha. There's no sushi. There's no kabuki theater. Maybe, just maybe, there's tea. Let's allow ourselves that. But really, what you're picturing comes centuries later. And I think, for me, that's what's so jaw-dropping about Genji's world. This is a Japan so ancient, so removed from the image that we carry in our heads, it's almost unrecognizable. Remember, this was being written when, in England, Ethelred the Unready was desperately scraping together silver to pay off marauding Vikings. Just imagine if the Anglo-Saxons had left us with a 1,000-page novel, a glittering window into their everyday life and their anxieties. I mean, historians would be weeping for joy. But Anglo-Saxon England just didn't have the social ingredients to cook up a masterpiece like Genji. Japan, on the other hand, somehow did. So let's talk about age. In the West, we often point to Don Quixote as Europe's first modern novel. Well, the tale of Genji is 600 years older. It predates Robinson Crusoe, often called the first English novel, by 700 years. It's not, strictly speaking, the oldest novel in the world, because the Greeks and the Romans, they had their prose, and they had their prose of fiction. But as Royal Tyler says in his translation, it's undeniably the oldest novel still widely read and recognized as a literary masterpiece. And I think that's really important. And that's what blows me away. The sheer alienness, the distant strangeness of it all. To stumble into Genji's world for the first time is like Keats, lost in Chapman's Homer, feeling, as he put it, like stout Cortez with eagle eyes staring at the Pacific. That's what reading Genji feels like. It's the literary equivalent of discovering someone was making rock and roll records in the 14th century, or that Cubist painters were actually hiding in Renaissance Florence. It just shouldn't exist. And yet, it does. Consider Japan's context, an island at the fringe of Eurasia, yet producing this astonishing work just as other civilizations are spinning their own epics. In Persia, Ferdowsi is writing the Shahnameh, with its giants, its sorcerers, and its cast of heroes. In Baghdad and Cairo, the Arabian Nights are starting to swirl together. Genies, flying carpets, talking beasts. In France, you get the Song of Roland, or masculine heroism and sword swinging at Charlemagne's court. And all these stories are full of monsters, magic, or mighty warriors. But Genji? Genji is not that kind of hero. He's not off fighting dragons. He's not battling brothers for a throne, not exiled to wander the world by himself. There's one brief stint in exile, and otherwise, his entire universe is in the palace and in the city that embraces that palace. There's no monsters. There's no magical adventures. Just the endlessly intricate politics and pleasures of the Heian court. So what does Genji do all day long in these 1,000 pages? Well, for one, he works. As his father had hoped, Genji throws himself into courtly service, working his way up from junior official to a kind of honorary retired emperor. He's even reinstigated into the imperial family at one point. The bureaucracy of the palace, the endless shuffling of titles and roles, it's all tracked with an obsessive, almost Trollopian detail. If you're fascinated by how politics works in a deeply ceremonial world, Genji's your man. But let's be honest, that's not why people remember him. To quote Chris Harding, a great friend of the show and author of a cracking history of Japan, Genji is irrepressibly amorous, which, to put it bluntly, makes him history's original kind of massive shagger. He never stops. He only has to glimpse a woman and, well, he's off, seducing with poetry and incense and his famously impeccable dress sense. Doesn't matter if the woman's married to the emperor or if she's 14 years old, his own ward, or even the daughter of a former lover. Genji is never short of a romantic challenge. This, as you might imagine, leads to all sorts of consequences. Not all of them happy, but it's the absolute pulse of the novel. It's intimate, it's deeply human, and it's often modern in its description of desire, heartbreak, and the messiness of life behind the polished screen of the imperial court. And that truly is what makes the tale of Genji so enduring, so strange, and so utterly compelling. But let's not beat around the bush. Genji, for all its charisma and poetic grace, would have been absolutely roasted on social media today. It would have been cancelled before lunchtime. He's not just flirting with danger, he's positively sprinting towards it. The daughter of his best friend? No problem. The ward he's supposed to be protecting? Absolutely. He doesn't hold back for a moment. This is not, to put it mildly, a Me Too role model. And it turns out, I'm not alone in thinking this, there's an entire school of Japanese feminist criticism, Genji Gurai, which literally means Genji bashing. And honestly, it's not hard to see why. He's the definitive model of charm and sophistication for 1,000 years, but if you dig a little deeper, there's a lot that's deeply uncomfortable. I love the idea of sitting down and reading up on Japanese feminist takes on Genji. No, not in Japanese. I wish. But there's plenty in English because the tale of Genji has inspired a tidal wave of commentary. But you know what? This is actually where the novel's real genius lies. Genji is not just some Don Juan, seduce and abandon, on to the next. He's appalling, yes, but he's also somehow attentive and generous and loyal in his own deeply flawed way. He never abandons the women he seduces. Instead, he fills his sprawling palace with them, even those he no longer loves, ensuring that they're cared for and they're looked after, and they can come and go as they please. They don't have to stay, but they choose to stay. It's not exactly noble, is it? But it's complicated, like everything in this particular book. And Genji himself? He's impossibly glamorous. I mean, literally perfumed. In a court where most people, kind of smelled of rice and incense, Genji's fragrance precedes him, and the novel describes him as almost supernaturally attractive, a man so radiant that just being near him is like standing under a cherry tree in bloom. Even after his death, the narrative lingers on his scent, and the same ethereal charm is passed down to his son and, of course, then to his grandson. He's more than just a character. He's mythical. But at the heart of it all, there is one relationship that stands apart, the great love of Genji's life, Lady Murasaki. And her name means lavender. And her story is where the novel's psychological complexity really shines. Genji meets her when she's a young girl. She's the daughter of a minor prince by a minor consort. So in the hierarchy of the court, she has no prospects whatsoever. Genji, seeing her resemblance to his own lost mother, decides to adopt her. It's deeply unsettling. His motives are questionable, I have to say, from the start. So why adopt her? Well, it's complicated and not in a good way. Genji's been having an affair with the Empress, who reminded him of his mother, and now Murasaki, in turn, reminds him of the Empress. And the Freudian knots are enough to give anyone a headache, I have to say. But he adopts her, he raises her, and when she comes of age, at 15, he forces himself on her. The novel doesn't sugarcoat this. Murasaki is traumatized, her trust utterly shattered, and she's left wondering bitterly why she ever trusted anyone. Genji, meanwhile, is perplexed. He can't understand why she's so devastated. When he finds her still sobbing, his response is almost baffled. Why is she making such a fuss? It's a moment that, even by the standards of the time, is written as deeply troubling. The novel doesn't flinch from the trauma or from Genji's obsessiveness. And yet, Murasaki stays. Partly out of decency, her prospects without him would be undeniably bleak, but also because in the labyrinth world of the court, love and power, trust and betrayal are hopelessly tangled. It's not a happy ending, and it's not a story of uncomplicated romance. And this, really, is what makes The Tale of Genji such a masterwork. It doesn't give us simple answers or tidy morals. Genji is a luminous, unforgettable figure, and also a profoundly flawed one. The women in his life are not mere conquests. They're living, breathing, suffering people. And the novel is very honest about the pain, the power, and the heartbreak. It's as psychologically rich and challenging as anything, I have to say, by Tolstoy or Eliot. So yes, if you ever find yourself rooting for Genji, remember, it's complicated, and that's exactly the point of the book. Throughout the novel, we're reminded, sometimes quite starkly, how precarious a young woman's life could be in Genji's world. If you were a girl without family, without prospects, you had, as the story puts it, just two fates open to you. take the veil and become a nun, or fling yourself into the sea. Not exactly a wealth of options. For Lady Murasaki, neither path is one she's eager to embrace, so she stays with Genji, and Genji, to his credit, if credit is actually the word, remains genuinely devoted to her. Their bond deepens against all the odds. In fact, it's Murasaki, with her humble background, who becomes the real mistress of Genji's vast, complicated household. She's known as the lady who reigns over Genji's household, the true chief wife, despite the court's tangled web of official and unofficial partners. I think what's extraordinary is how the novel traces the arc of their relationship over decades. We watch them grow older together, their love changing, weathering storms, darkened by grief and brightened by forgiveness. It's a love story, but one of uncommon honesty and, I have to say, deep emotional depth. There's a moment close to the end that always gets me, Genji, at the end of his glittering, kind of restless life, gazes at Murasaki and wonders, how is it possible that, year after year, day after day, she always seemed to possess something marvelous, something new? It's the voice of a man awed by his partner's mystery, even after a lifetime together. When Murasaki dies, it breaks Genji utterly, and he then follows her soon after. You're then left by the close of their story with a sense of a love affair that is messy, troubled, and yet somehow transcendent. This isn't easy, happy, ever after fiction. It's far more haunting than that. And again, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Genji's devotion to Murasaki does not mean he's sworn off his other interests. Far from it. When Murasaki holds his heart, his house is still crowded with wives, lovers, old flames, even the daughters and friends of friends. This too was the norm for a grand nobleman in the 11th century in Japan. The novel actually draws all these relationships with subtlety, with warmth, and I think also with a very wry sense of humor. It's as if, by the end, you've watched Mr. Darcy settle down with Elizabeth Bennet, but also with Fanny Price and Miss Bates, and, a whole cavalcade of Austen's heroines, all under one roof, each with her own complicated story. What's remarkable, though, is the novel sense of time passing. Unlike most ancient epics, which are all heroes and stasis, the tale of Genji is suffused with a sense of impermanence. We see Genji and his lovers grow older, loves wax and wane, beauty fades, memories deepen. The characters actually reflect again and again on how fleeting everything is, how love, sorrow, and even life itself are as ephemeral as cherry blossoms. The image, of course, is Japan's great literary motif, but it's here in Genji that the blossom metaphor truly begins to, I think, blaze its trail through the centuries. Again and again, the characters are in search of lost time, chasing moments of joy or youth, knowing all the while that everything, even the greatest happiness, will eventually fall like petals on the breeze. It's the same spirit that runs through Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, often cited as the finest novel of the 20th century, but written 1,000 years after Lady Murasaki first set brush to scroll. And I think that perhaps is the most moving part of it all, the sense that these lives, so strange and so distant, are somehow very deeply familiar, that across the centuries and continents, people love, people grieve, and they yearn for meaning, exactly as we do today. As I was reading Genji, I kept being haunted by a single thought. Was I just imagining this, or was there something oddly Proustian about it all? Turns out it wasn't just me being fanciful. A quick search when I got home actually landed me straight into a whole academic rabbit warren. Take J. Keith Vincent, professor of Japanese studies at Boston University, as an example. He gave a whole lecture just a few months ago on exactly this topic, The Tale of Genji and Proust in Search of Lost Time. Both novels, he says, are about the suffering caused by desire, the way humans try to find substitutes for their first loves, and that great melancholy truth: everything, even grief, perishes with time. It's a striking comparison, I have to say. Genji and Proust, 1,000 years apart, yet both obsessed with the fleeting nature of passion, memory, and longing. And they're not the only ones. Readers and critics have compared Genji to Anna Karenina, War and Peace, the big Tolstoyan epics. And it raises a question, I think, that's genuinely fascinating. How is it that something so modern, a sprawling psychological novel, emerges not in Victorian London or Paris or St. Petersburg, but in 11th century Japan? A medieval society of swords, palaces, and elaborate rituals, producing a work that feels as modern today and as emotionally nuanced as anything by Tolstoy or Proust. And that's why, quite frankly, Genji, I think, absolutely belongs on a history podcast. Trying to explain how the novel happened opens a window into everything: politics, power, gender, poetry, and the soul of Japan in its first golden age. So, if you're with me for part 2, because there is a part 2, that's where I'm heading. The big question, the one we've been skirting around since the beginning. Who actually wrote The Tale of Genji? Now, prepare yourself for a bit of a twist, because if you thought Genji was just the product of some wish fulfillment fantasy, perfumed, charming, seducing his way through the imperial court, think again. The Tale of Genji is the work not of a man, but of a woman, Lady Murasaki Shikibu. Born in the 970s, died around 1020, she was a courtier, a poet, and by all accounts, an entire enigma. Her own self-portrait? Not exactly a bundle of joy. She was, she says, in her own words, pretentious. She was awkward. She was very hard to approach, prickly, haughty, disdainful, I have to say, cantankerous, absolutely, and scornful. And yet, when you met her for the first time, she was shy and gentle, almost meek, a completely different creature from the one that her reputation actually suggested. Her name is even a puzzle. Murasaki Shikibu. It's not her real name at all. In the world of the imperial court, real names were for servants. Men were known by their titles. So throughout the novel, Genji is the High Captain, the Grand Counselor, and eventually the Commander of the Right. His Grace, Palace Minister. And again, towards the end of his life, the Honorary Retired Emperor. This can be a complete headache for the modern reader, I have to say. As, characters are promoted, they're then renamed, and they're reshuffled as the chapters fly by. It's actually a bit like reading War and Peace. And if you can imagine doing that, and then everyone keeps changing their surnames every few pages, that's kind of what you get in The Tale of Genji. But women at court? No formal titles. Instead, they got nicknames, often referencing their family, a place in the palace, or a job their father held. So Genji's mother, who we meet at the very start, is known as the Kirisabu Intimate, because she's lived in the Kirisabu wing of the palace, and because, well, she was the emperor's favorite. Not a bad address as far as the palace real estate goes, but not the grandest either, which immediately sets her status in the pecking order. It's a world where who you are is always defined by where you are, who you know, and how you move through the shifting sands of courtly rank and gossip. And it's from within this world, the dizzying swirl of power, envy, poetry, longing, that Lady Murasaki gave us one of the world's great masterpieces. And with that, we come to the end of part one. But in part two, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into Lady Murasaki's own life and how she wrote this astonishing novel and what it tells us about the real court behind the fiction. So don't go anywhere, and we're just going to take a message from our sponsor. Altadomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much, much more than that. When you sign up with Altadomus, you become part of a larger community. A community that actually cares about you and your family in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. For more information, go talk to TG or WhatsApp him on +60 12 49 37 270 or visit their website penangmyhome.com. And we're back. So let's get into these names, because the naming conventions at the Imperial Court are absolutely fascinating and sometimes unintentionally hilarious. When Genji's mother gives birth to him, her nickname changes. Now she's called the Kiritsubo Nyogo, or the Kiritsubo Haven. In this context, Haven is a kind of unofficial title, and it's only bestowed upon women who bear children to emperors or their heirs apparent. And it literally means the place where the august seed comes to rest. But here's the thing, if you're not a Haven, if you don't have a child by an emperor, then your nickname might come from almost anything. You know, your family's residence, your father's job, or even your own personal quirks. That then brings us to Lady Murasaki Shikibu herself. Murasaki is actually the name of Genji's great love in the novel, a character with whom the author is very closely identified. Shikibu refers to her father's position. He worked in the Ministry of Ceremonials, which handled all the parades, the rituals, the grand spectacles of court life. So for women at court, your identity was stitched from your family connections and your father's rank. So think of it a little bit like this. If you were in our world, you might end up as, Tabby from the Foreign Office, just because your dad happened to be a diplomat. For Lady Murasaki, it's very much a label, a badge. And sometimes I think also a burden. And Lady Murasaki is actually aware of all the opportunities denied to her as a woman. She's been painfully conscious of this imbalance since childhood. In her early diary, which is actually an astonishing work she kept for several years while writing Genji, she describes listening in as her brother is taught the lessons meant for a future imperial official. She writes, "I was in the habit of listening to my brother's lessons, and I became unusually proficient at understanding what he struggled with. My father, the most learned man, always regretted this fact. Just my luck, he'd say. What a pity she wasn't born a boy." And let's just pause on that just for a second. As I said, this is being written in the 11th century, the age of the Anglo-Saxons in England. Imagine if we had a diary like this from an Anglo-Saxon woman of the time. The fact is, we don't. Even in the West, where you find powerful, educated women like Edith, wife of Edward the Confessor, they leave us little more than echoes of what they thought. But Lady Murasaki gives us her own voice, as clear as day, reaching out over 1,000 years. And you can't help but notice, it's not quite feminist, but it is powerfully, personally resentful of the way men monopolize education. Now, part of her genius is personal. She's bright, she's curious, she's determined. She's a very sharp observer, and she soaks in everything around her at court. And she filters that into her work. But it also begs the bigger question. Why was this possible in Japan at this precise moment? How could a woman produce one of the world's literary masterpieces in the 11th century? Well, I think it turns out the reasons are actually structural, and they're deeply rooted in the society and the cultural Heian Japan. And they're not just fascinating for what they say about the Lady Murasaki, but for what they tell us about Japan itself, how it blossomed into a unique civilization with its own voice. Just to add a little color, Murasaki was sometimes mockingly nicknamed Lady Chronicle. And that's because the oldest surviving Japanese texts, the Nihon Shokai and the Kojiki, were written centuries before, in the early 8th century. The first is in Japanese, the second is in Chinese, and between them they spin out a sweeping history of Japan, beginning with the creation of the universe. There's gods, heroes, and myths, an entire nation's epic rolled into parchment. So even in her own time, Lady Murasaki was seen as the chronicler of her age. And not always fondly, but sometimes she was also the butt of jokes, sometimes quietly resented. But as a writer, as a witness at court, and as a voice, she was entirely her own. So to really understand the backdrop of the tale of Genji, you have to look at how the imperial line in Japan was defined, and more importantly, justified. The official story, as recorded in Japan's oldest chronicles, is that every single emperor is directly descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess herself. This isn't just ancient myth-making. This is still woven into imperial ritual and ideology today. I mean, you don't hear Charles III bragging about being descended from Woden or Odin, but the current Japanese emperor? Absolutely. His divine lineage is straight from the sun, and it's a pillar of national identity. According to these chronicles, the first emperor, the splendidly named Jimmu, was Amaterasu's great-grandson, sent down from heaven to tame and unify Japan. And he takes on all sorts of colorful opponents, at one point fighting against people known as the earth spiders, because their arms and legs are so absurdly long. Jimmu reigns for a staggeringly 170 years, and he's followed by a series of equally long-lived but frankly anonymous, successors, much like those biblical patriarchs who kind of lived for 300 or 400 years. And of course, not that actual Japanese people live quite that long, but it all adds up to a genealogy that claims to stretch back for thousands of years. And this is exactly the point, because the truth is, the imperial line isn't as ancient as these stories claim. In reality, until just a few centuries before Lady Murasaki's time, the imperial family was just one of several powerful clans, jostling for dominance in central Japan, particularly in the Yamato Basin, the heartland of Honshu. Even by Murasaki's day, not all of Honshu was truly under imperial control either. And the far north, places like Hokkaido, was still home to so-called barbarians. So the whole point of these chronicles is to build up the dynasty, to make it seem uniquely ancient, universal, and of course divinely sanctioned. There's even an official decree from the 7th century that says, "There are not two suns in the sky, nor two lords on earth." And the message is clear. There is only one imperial family, and everyone else is subordinate. So around that time, the emperor starts calling himself Tenno, the heavenly sovereign. And the region of Yamato gets a new poetic name, the root of the sun, or Nihon, which is where we get Japan. So even the country's name is bound up with the image of the imperial family as the chosen rulers. Now, if all this sounds a bit familiar, it should, because throughout Eurasian history, you see very similar moves. As monarchies become more kind of centralized, they create cults of personality, invent ancient lineages, and they surround themselves with the most amazing myths. What makes Japan, I think, distinctive, though, is the colossal influence of its neighbor, China. Japan has never ever been a bubble. It's not the only East Asian country with an emperor who claims to be from the center of the world. China, though, is the heavyweight, the regional superpower. It was then, it is now. It was the Rome and the Constantinople of Asia rolled into one. And when Japan issues that ringing decree about there being only one sun in the sky, it's essentially copying China. The very word tenno, emperor, comes from the Chinese where it means pole star, the throne of heaven. The Chinese, for their part, are entirely unimpressed. There's a story from the 7th century. A Japanese envoy sends a letter to China announcing the child of heaven in the land where the sun rises greets the child of heaven in the land where the sun sets. Now, the Chinese emperor at the time is absolutely furious and declares the letter barbaric and orders it not to be brought to his attention ever again. And that's one way to get ghosted by the superpower of the day. But a bit of imperial side eye wasn't going to stop the Japanese monarchy from modeling itself on China. In the early 7th century, what historians call the Great Reform begins. Japanese officials and scholars are actually sent to China to study everything from bureaucracy to poetry. They bring back Confucian ideals, the concept of a centralized state, a meteocratic civil service, all the building blocks of a proper imperial court. And crucially, they bring back Chinese literary culture. Chinese becomes the language of government and scholarship, effectively the Japanese equivalent of Latin in medieval Europe. To get ahead at court, you needed to master Chinese. And when written Chinese is developed, it borrows Chinese characters. So Japanese high culture is deeply, consciously rooted in China, even as it's beginning to grow its own uniquely Japanese branches. It's in this world, a world of borrowed grandeur, carefully constructed myths, and new literary horizons, that Lady Murasaki sets her pen to paper and creates something entirely original. So let's just talk about these early chronicles, the ones that lay out the glory and antiquity of the Japanese imperial line. The first is written in Japanese, the second in Chinese, which is actually extraordinary, isn't it? Imagine a patriotic history being composed in what, for most readers was a foreign language. But as with medieval Europe and Latin, this made sense. When you want your culture to look prestigious and worldly, you write in a language of the Homogen. And in 8th century East Asia, the Homogen is very much China. It's around this time in the early 700s that the Japanese monarchy gets serious about putting down roots. Before then, the convention had been to move the court every time an emperor died, kind of keeping things spiritually fresh, but logistically chaotic. The Chinese didn't do that. The Chinese had a vast permanent capital. So Japan founds its own fixed capital, Nara, right in the heart of Yamato, the imperial family's home turf. And they don't just build it, they model it directly, almost slavishly, on China's grid system. And it's not just architecture. Japan welcomes a flood of immigrants from China and Korea. Scholars, artists, musicians, architects, dancers, writers. It's almost a cultural gold rush. In fact, so much early Chinese dance and music was actually wiped out by the Mongol invasions that, centuries later, if Chinese scholars wanted to study their own lost arts, they came to Japan to do it. Japan in this era is like a sponge, soaking up foreign ideas, technologies, and talents with an almost unrivaled enthusiasm. Ivan Morris, a great fan of the show, who wrote The Magnificent World of the Shining Prince. Rarely in the history of a world has a country entirely free from external pressure as Japan was, so avidly acquired the fruits of an alien culture. The only real parallel, he says, is the Meiji Restoration, where Japan reopened to the West in the 19th century, and once again absorbed everything it could lay its hands on. But here's the twist. For all their copying, the Japanese never became new Chinese. They absorbed what they needed, but always bent it to their own distinctly Japanese style. There's always a tension. There's admiration for China's glory, but there's also a very fierce pride in their own culture. Of course, not everyone was thrilled with the new Chinese-inspired bureaucracy. The old aristocracy, the ancient families of Japan were not going to let themselves be sidelined by a bunch of upstart civil servants who simply aced their exam. So, during the Nara period, the nobility was still very much in charge, furiously competing not to overthrow the monarchy, but to effectively, I think, dominate it. The trick? Marry your daughter to the emperor. If she bears him a son, voila, your bloodline rules. And of course, this leads to intense, sometimes violent fractionalism. The emperor's authority is always at risk of being swallowed by his clan rivals. Eventually, Emperor Kanmu decides he's had enough of the drama in Nara. Like a Japanese Louis XIV leaving Paris for Versailles, he finds a new capital while out hunting, and he calls it Heian, the city of peace and tranquility, which will become the Kyoto that we know today. The city is laid out, again, just like the Chinese capital. Palaces to the north, bustling markets to the south, great avenues crisscrossing the city like Manhattan. The symmetry doesn't last. Parts drift, parts are abandoned. But the intent is there. It's a Chinese version remade in Japanese colors. And here's the thing that gets interesting for me. Even as Chinese institutions and culture remained the gold standard by Murasaki's day, Japanese officials decided they don't need to keep looking outward. In the year 894, they stop sending embassies to China. The door closes, and Japan starts to turn inwards, effectively refining what it's learned and building its own identity. By the time Lady Murasaki is born, foreign visitors are a rarity. In fact, in the entire tale of Genji, the only foreigner with a speaking part is a Korean fortune teller who delivers a crucial prophecy about Genji's fate. So, what does all this tell us about Murasaki and her world? Well, if Chinese was the language of high culture, like Latin in medieval Europe, it was also a marker of masculine status. Murasaki herself, as she tells us in her diary, learned Chinese to a high degree of fluency, probably better than her brother, and she absolutely loved it. But at court, this was seen as eccentric, almost improper, if you like. Definitely off-putting to potential suitors. You can't have a smart woman in court. She describes how the other ladies in waiting would whisper about her. They would call her the Lady Chronicle and gently mock her for being, I suppose, in effect, a nerd. But Murasaki can't help herself. Books are her absolute refuge. She finds a stash of Chinese texts in the palace and she devours them, reading for solace as much for learning. It's the bookish child's lament across the centuries, isn't it? Bullied a bit lonely, but absolutely enchanted by the written word. And when she later teaches the Empress Chinese, they have to do it in secret, lest it become another source of gossip and ridicule. Even in the tale of Genji, there's an undercurrent of this, the tension between Chinese culture and Japanese identity, between masculine status and feminine genius, between old forms and very new voices. And here's where Lady Murasaki pulls off something truly revolutionary. In her own writing and in the tale of Genji, she flips expectations on their head. There's a striking scene where the daughter of a great scholar secretly teaches her lover Chinese, a real gender inversion of the time, with a woman taking on the traditional male role as teacher. But it has to be hidden, of course. It has to be kept absolutely secret. Why? Because at court, Chinese script and literature are men's own territory. Chinese characters, men's writing were seen as the exclusive preserve of the educated male elite. For women, it was very different. By Murasaki's time, the Japanese had developed their own flowing, phonetic script, hiragana, but then it was called onade, literally women's hand. And this writing for women by women in a style not constrained by the weight of Chinese modules was unique. If you wrote in Chinese, you followed the rigid formulas and structures of the classics. But in onade, the rules hadn't been set. There was no canon, no pattern to copy, just the freedom to invent. Imagine that. And that's the magic, isn't it? Murasaki, with her diary and her stories, is playing with this new script, this woman's hand. You know, the court itself is her stage, and it's only a small step from writing about real courtiers to dreaming up a dazzling, fictitious prince and setting him loose in a world inspired by her own. The tale of Genji is possible precisely because it's written in a script and a style that is still fresh and completely unbound. But here's what's truly extraordinary. Murasaki wasn't alone. The Heian court was bursting with creative women, bold, witty, and fiercely original. In fact, in my next episode, I'll introduce you to another genius of the age, the author of a work that's not just witty and sharp, but impossibly elegant. A woman who, it has to be said, Murasaki loathed, partly because she was everything Murasaki was not. She was extroverted, she was flamboyant, the life of the party. Their literary rivalry mirrored the fierce political rivalries at the heart of the imperial court itself. And the other work? The Pillow Book, written by Sei Shōnagon, a masterpiece in its own right. And I have to say, the perfect companion to Genji. Thanks to Murasaki and Shōnagon, and to the extraordinary women writers of Heian Japan, we have a more vivid, more intimate, and detailed portrait of court life than any other culture from this era. So, join me in part 2 as we open up the world of the Heian court and meet the dazzling Sei Shōnagon and see how the literary and political dramas of this golden age continue to echo down the centuries. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.